I stopped at the doorway, watching him. His shoulders were slightly hunched from long hours at the desk, and the light from the lamp cast a sharp line across them. It seemed like he didn't even notice me, absorbed in his strict world of numbers and formulas. Alfredo had always been like that, practical, focused, reliable. I used to admire that about him, his ability to keep everything under control, his calm strength. But now, all of that felt like a wall that I could no longer break through. I took a sip of water, feeling the cold liquid soothe my throat a little, but it did nothing to calm the heat inside. Nestor's words kept spinning in my mind. "You have no idea how much I'm waiting for you." These simple phrases sounded as if he saw me the way I hadn't felt in a long time, desired, alive, real. The moment I read the message, something inside me stirred, uncertainty or maybe fear. I knew I was playing with fire, but this fire had already started to blaze, and I couldn't find the strength to put it out. Alfredo leaned back in his chair again, stretching lazily, as if his body, weary from long and monotonous work, needed a break. I turned my gaze away, not wanting to meet his eyes, although I knew he wouldn't look in my direction anyway. Our life had turned into a routine. Mornings began with silent coffee, the days passed in errands and concerns, and evenings ended with his work and my pointless wandering around the house. I tried to remember the last time we just sat together, talking not about business, but about us, about what mattered to us, but all that came to mind was endless silence. I returned to the window, resting my palms on the sill. Down on the street, a couple walked together under a single umbrella, laughing as though they needed nothing but each other. A faint sense of envy pricked at my heart. I remember when Alfredo and I could walk like that, hand in hand, laughing at trivial things, not noticing anything around us. Back then, I thought he was my island of peace in this restless world. But now the island felt empty. He was there, yet at the same time, somewhere far away, like a shore gradually disappearing beyond the horizon. My phone buzzed again in the pocket of my robe. I jumped, startled as if by a gunshot, but quickly grabbed it so Alfredo wouldn't notice. A new message from Nestor. "Are you sure you can make it tomorrow?" His words were brief, but between the lines, there was something more, impatience, desire, as though he was challenging me. I felt my pulse quicken, and I hastily put the phone back in my pocket. Alfredo stood up. I heard his footsteps heading toward the bedroom. He always went to bed earlier than me, and this had become an unspoken ritual that allowed both of us to avoid conversation. I was left alone in the darkness of the living room, feeling as though layers were being slowly peeled away from me, revealing something deeply hidden. Something I was afraid of, but could not ignore. When I lay down in bed, Alfredo was already asleep. His breathing was steady, calm, and his face was so peaceful that I almost felt a pang of guilt. But that feeling quickly dissolved into thoughts about tomorrow. Tomorrow, I would see Nestor. Tomorrow, I would feel that lightness he gave me again. Tomorrow. I first met Nestor at the opening of my exhibition. Michelle, my longtime friend and curator, helped me greet the guests. He was, as always, energetic, joking, and skillfully juggling compliments between critics and collectors. His loud laughter echoed here and there, infecting everyone around. "Lucia, come here," he called, and I had to struggle through the crowd. "Let me introduce you to Nestor. A photographer, a traveler, an eternal restless soul. He wants to buy your painting." Nestor. Tall, with dark eyes that reflected a world unknown to me. He stood before my painting, and I felt exposed, as if he saw not just the paint on the canvas, but something much deeper. Nestor didn't rush to look away from the painting, but it seemed his attention had long since shifted to me. He stood close, but not too close to cross the line of propriety, yet his presence was palpable. I could feel my cheeks betraying me, burning, and I tried to hide my embarrassment behind a faint smile. "Do you often depict water?" he asked, not turning his head. The question caught me off guard with its simplicity, yet there was genuine interest in it. Water for me is more than just an element. It's changeable, alive. The calm on the surface always hides the movement beneath, I answered. The words came surprisingly easily, as if this conversation had been written by someone else long ago. Nestor smiled slightly, turning toward me. As a photographer, I always look for that edge where stillness becomes movement. Your paintings are about that. They seem to call you to explore what lies beyond the horizon. That's a beautiful compliment, I replied, feeling my heart beat faster than I would have liked. His gaze was unwavering, as if studying me like a work of art, noticing details I hadn't even seen myself. Sylvia, standing a little to the side, watched us with narrowed eyes, clearly sensing that something more than just a conversation was happening between us. Well, she muttered and quickly retreated, leaving us alone amid the crowd. Michel reappeared beside us, effortlessly breaking the tension with his casual demeanor. Nestor, if you'd like to discuss purchasing, I can show you more of Lucia's works, he offered. But Nestor, without breaking his gaze from me, shook his head. No, this painting is exactly what I need. It's as if it's been waiting for me, he said. There was something personal in those words, and I couldn't hide the slight shiver that ran through my body. Later, when the guests started to leave, I found myself alone in the corner of the hall, watching the assistants pack up the remains of the exhibition. Nestor approached me, as though he had been waiting for everyone to go so we could be alone. I feel like we're alike, he said suddenly. His voice dropped to a quieter tone, making it even more penetrating. You create images on canvas, and I capture them through a lens. But all of that is just the tip of the iceberg, isn't it? True art is what remains unseen. His words touched something deep inside me. I felt my usual defenses crumble. Are you suggesting that I'm hiding something? I asked, more to regain control of the situation than to actually seek an answer. We all hide something, he replied. But with you, it's not even an attempt to conceal. It's more of a caution, to make sure nothing too precious slips out. I didn't know how to respond. His words lingered in the air, leaving me with a heavy, yet sweet feeling of exposure. After the exhibition, I tried to push the encounter out of my mind. I told myself it was just a casual interest from a new buyer, nothing more. But over the next week, thoughts of Nestor kept returning, again and again. I remembered his voice, his words, that look from which I couldn't escape. It seemed to me that he had said more than he even realized. Sylvia noticed my odd behavior by the second day. We were sitting in a small cafe, discussing her latest relationship, which she referred to as the disaster of the year. She suddenly fell silent and squinted at me, studying me closely. You're not listening to me, she said. What's going on? I am listening, I protested, trying to focus, but I knew I wasn't fooling her. Lucia, we've known each other since childhood. I can tell when you're interested in something, she leaned forward, her gaze turning serious. Who is he? Those words pierced through me like arrows. No one, I blurted out, hoping to avoid any further questions. You should see your face, she scoffed, leaning back in her chair. Better tell me everything yourself, or I'll hear it from Michel. And you know how he loves to gossip. I laughed, but it was a nervous laugh, hiding my confusion. I couldn't tell her that this person was more than just a buyer. That his words, his presence made me think about things I hadn't dared to touch in years. That evening, I came home later than usual. Alfredo was already there, absorbed in his blueprints. He glanced at me briefly but said nothing, returning to his calculations. A strange feeling of duality overcame me. On one hand, I was grateful for his silence, which allowed me to hide. On the other, this silence had become unbearable. It seemed to underscore the growing chasm between us. When I lay down to sleep, his breathing had already become steady and deep. I lay next to him, staring at the ceiling, fragments of thoughts swirling in my mind. Nestor, his words, his gaze. Tomorrow, I was going to meet him again. Our next meeting took place on a warm autumn day. The cafe was almost empty, with only an elderly couple sitting at a distant table reading newspapers, and the waitress, leaning against the bar, lazily flipping through a magazine. Nestor was sitting by the window, the sunlight playing in his dark hair. I entered, feeling a slight shiver, whether from anticipation or fear, I couldn't tell. "Lucia," he said, standing to greet me. His voice was low and soft, as though he were saying my name in a way no one else ever had. I smiled, trying to mask the awkwardness that swept over me. He pulled out a chair for me, and I sat down across from him. 2 cups of coffee were already on the table, the aroma filling the space between us. Nestor looked calm, but his gaze was intent, too perceptive. "You look especially beautiful today," he said, not taking his eyes off my face. I felt my face flush, but I tried to brush off the compliment. "You always say that. Is it a habit or a tactic?" I joked, but inside, something stirred. "No, it's true," he replied simply, with such sincerity that I was left speechless. We talked about trivial things, my new paintings, his plans for another photo assignment. But every word, every pause between us, was filled with something more than just conversation. When Nestor leaned in closer to tuck a stray lock of hair behind my ear, I felt the world around me disappear. The movement was so natural that I didn't even pull away. "Have you ever felt like someone truly sees you?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper. I paused, but I didn't have an answer. Alfredo, my husband, who had once seemed like the closest person to me, had long since stopped noticing me. He only saw a convenient habit, a part of his routine. But Nestor, his words, his gaze, his presence made me feel alive. When I returned home, silence greeted me at the door. Alfredo hadn't come back from work yet, and the house felt emptier than usual. I walked into the kitchen, put the kettle on, and automatically grabbed my sketchpad to make a few sketches. But instead of lines and shapes, only erratic strokes filled the paper. I put the pencil down, feeling that my thoughts were too heavy to express at that moment. The phone vibrated. It was Sylvia. "We're having wine with Michelle at the bar. Join us," she said with such enthusiasm that I couldn't refuse. I arrived an hour later. The bar was small and cozy, with soft lighting and the hum of lively voices. Sylvia was already waiting at a table, with Michelle beside her, gesturing animatedly and laughing loudly. When I approached, they both greeted me with cheerful exclamations. "Lucia, you're so rarely out. We were starting to think you've become a nun," Sylvia said, pulling out a chair for me. "Or that you're hiding something interesting from us," added Michelle, winking. I laughed, trying to hide my discomfort. "I've just been busy with work," I said, but Sylvia snorted, clearly not believing me. We spent the evening talking and laughing, but I could feel Sylvia's eyes on me. Her gaze was intense, too observant, as if she were trying to peer into my thoughts. When I briefly stepped away from the table to answer a call, she followed me. "Lucia, I know something's going on," she said when we were out of earshot by the bar. "You can't hide it forever. I can see it in your eyes." I wanted to argue, but the words stuck in my throat. Sylvia was right. My life was cracking apart, and I didn't know how to put it back together. Later, on my way home, I thought again about Nestor. His words, his touch, they seemed to provoke some inner battle in me. But every time I pictured his face, I felt not just desire, but an increasing sense of guilt toward Alfredo. Could I continue living this double life? Or was this the inevitable beginning of the end? The next day, I went to meet Nestor. We walked along the river, and suddenly he said, "You should leave him. This isn't life, it's a cage." His words pierced me. I had already thought about it, but fear paralyzed me. At that moment, I felt someone's piercing gaze. Turning, I spotted a familiar figure, Alfredo. He stood at the far end of the bridge, his silhouette cutting through the mist rising from the river. The streetlights cast long shadows, making his figure seem even more imposing. I froze, as if struck by thunder, unable to tear my gaze away. Inside, everything snapped. The heart that had just moments before beat in time with Nestor's words, froze, turning into a block of ice. "Lucia, what's going on?" Nestor's voice was soft, but I could hear concern in it. He too turned and immediately understood who was standing before us. A mix of challenge and readiness appeared on his face. "Is this him?" he asked, not hiding his bitterness. I didn't answer. My voice betrayed me and went silent, and my legs felt rooted to the ground. Alfredo started walking toward us, his steps echoing loudly despite the soft sound of water under the bridge. He walked confidently, slowly, as if deliberately stretching the agonizing seconds of waiting. "Lovely evening for a walk, isn't it?" he said, stopping at arm's length. His voice was even, but his eyes told a different story. There was a storm brewing in them, suppressed and hidden, but ready to break out. "Alfredo." I began, but he raised his hand, signaling me to be quiet. "No need for words, Lucia," he said, not looking at me. His gaze was fixed on Nestor, as though trying to understand who this man was standing beside me. "You must be Nestor, I assume?" Nestor nodded, his eyes never leaving Alfredo's. He appeared calm, but his fingers involuntarily clenched into fists, betraying the tension. "Interesting," Alfredo continued, his voice almost thoughtful. "I always thought I knew her. Knew what she sought, what she dreamed of. And now, I look at the two of you and realize I might have been wrong. Alfredo, this isn't what you think." I began, but stopped again. The words seemed meaningless. How could I explain something I didn't fully understand myself? "Not what I think." He looked at me, his gaze sharp like a blade. "Then explain. Explain to me what this is." He gestured at the two of us. His voice rose, but it was still controlled, almost painfully calm. It was worse than shouting. Nestor took a step forward, and I noticed his jaw tense. "If you have something to say it to me," he shot back, staring directly into Alfredo's face. "No," Alfredo answered with a bitter smile. "This isn't between you and me. This is between me and her." He looked at me again, and at that moment, his eyes seemed impermeable. "Lucia, it's your choice. Do you want to leave? Then say it now. Here." The words got stuck in my throat. I saw how Nestor clenched his fists, ready for a fight, but the fight wasn't with him. It was within me. Alfredo looked at me with expectation, but his gaze was no longer confident. There was pain in it that he couldn't hide. I whispered, but my lips couldn't form the rest. Everything seemed blurry, the sound of the water, the flickering of the streetlights, even the faces of the men standing across from me. Each of them was waiting for my answer, but I didn't even know what it should be. Suddenly, Alfredo lowered his head and took a step back. "You know, Lucia, silence speaks louder than words." His voice grew softer, almost indifferent. "If you couldn't say it, then I already know the answer." I stepped toward him, but he raised his hand, stopping me. "No. Don't. You've already made your choice, even if you haven't said it out loud." He looked at me one last time, as though trying to memorize my face, then turned and walked away. "Lucia, you have to do something," Nestor said, as Alfredo's figure faded into the mist. But I stood there, paralyzed, feeling my heart split in two. Nestor's words hung in the air, but I knew that making a choice right then seemed impossible. That evening, when I returned home, Alfredo was waiting for me in the living room. His face was gray, like stone, and my phone lay on the table, open to a message from Nestor. "This has gone on too long," he said. "I wanted to believe you were just tired. But now everything is clear." I remained silent. All the words I could have said seemed pointless. Alfredo stood up from the chair, his movements sharp but controlled, like someone desperately trying to maintain control. He slowly walked across the room, not looking at me, as though afraid that a single glance would break him. "I asked myself 1,000 questions," he began, stopping by the window. His silhouette looked angular in the soft light of the lamp. "I thought it was my fault. Maybe I worked too much. Maybe I stopped listening to you. Stopped being the person you once loved." His voice faltered, but he quickly regained composure. In that moment, I wanted to say something, interrupt him, but the words never came. I just stood there, feeling the walls of the room slowly closing in on me. "But you know what's the worst, Lucia?" He turned toward me, and in his eyes, there was a fire I hadn't seen in a long time. I still wanted to believe. Even when the suspicions became obvious. Even when your looks and smiles, which used to be mine, suddenly disappeared. I lowered my head, trying to hide my tears, but he noticed. His gaze softened, and that made it even harder for me. "If you wanted to leave, why didn't you just say it? Why did it have to be like this? Why did it have to kill us slowly?" I took a step toward him, but he raised his hand, as if creating an invisible barrier between us. "No. Don't come closer. Not now." His voice was hoarse, as if every word caused him physical pain. "Alfredo, I finally managed to squeeze out, but my words drowned in bitterness. How could I explain something I couldn't fully understand myself? How could I justify something that felt both right and wrong at the same time? Nestor had awakened something in me that had long been forgotten, but in that moment, I was facing the man I had once loved with all my heart. "I don't want to listen," he interrupted, turning back to the window. "I thought I knew you, Lucia. But it seems I was wrong." He took a deep breath and exhaled sharply, as though trying to expel the pain building inside him. "You know what's the strangest thing? I'm not angry. Not like I should be. I'm just tired. Tired of the lies, of trying to guess what's going on in your head. Tired of fighting for us alone." His words, filled with quiet, destructive truth, made me freeze. I wanted to say something, to justify myself, to explain, but every attempt turned into an empty silence. Everything he said was true. I hadn't tried to save us. I had simply let my feelings pull me in another direction, without thinking about the consequences. Alfredo grabbed his jacket from the chair and headed for the door. His steps were measured, but every movement carried an inner struggle. "I'm going away for a few days," he threw over his shoulder. "I need to figure this out. About us. Or rather, what's left of us." When the door closed behind him, silence enveloped me completely. I sank onto the couch, feeling as though my legs could no longer hold me up. My chest tightened, and the air became thick and heavy, as if the room itself were filled with suffering that couldn't be ignored. The phone on the table vibrated again. The screen lit up, and a message from Nestor appeared. "Are you okay?" I stared at the text, but couldn't bring myself to reply. My entire life suddenly seemed like a web of contradictions, each pulling me in different directions. In my head, Alfredo's voice echoed, "If you wanted to leave, why didn't you just say it?" A question that had now become torturous for me. Why hadn't I said it? Why had I walked that razor's edge for so long, trying to hold both sides of my life together, knowing that one of them would inevitably collapse? Alfredo packed his things and left the next morning. On the table, he left a letter. "I loved you. Perhaps I still do. But you've chosen another path, and I can't be your companion on it. I looked at the words and felt something important inside me tear apart. The letter lay in front of me, its words draining the air from the room. I read the lines over and over again, as if trying to find something that wasn't there. A glimmer of hope, an unspoken promise to hold on to. But they were as straightforward as a knife. He was gone. Gone from our life, from our home, from that quiet routine that once seemed like a prison to me, and now, like a sanctuary I had lost. The house, usually filled with the sound of his footsteps, his voice, felt unnaturally empty. Silence crashed over me like a heavy weight, as if a concrete wall were slowly squeezing my chest. For a moment, I felt lost, like a child abandoned in an unfamiliar place. I reached for my phone, but stopped. What was I going to do? Call Nestor? Sylvia? None of them could fill this emptiness now. I got up to walk around the house, but every corner, every little detail seemed to bring me back to what was now gone. His jacket, which he always tossed over the back of the chair in the hallway, was no longer there. The books he used to pile carelessly by the bed had vanished. Even his mug on the kitchen table, always in the same spot, seemed almost offensively absent. I walked to the window, trying to distract myself, and looked out at the city, drowning in the glow of the evening lights. People below hurried about their business, their shadows flickering under streetlights, each one rushing to its own quiet place. Where was Alfredo now? How did he feel leaving this house, this life? I imagined him, strict, composed, with a stone-cold expression on his face. But behind that mask, I knew there was pain. It was there, in his eyes when he left, though he tried to hide it. The phone trembled on the table, pulling me back to reality. It was a message from Nestor. How are you? A brief question, but I could sense the worry behind it. I picked up the phone but didn't reply immediately. Instead, I slowly sank down onto the couch, feeling the exhaustion wash over me like a wave. I thought I knew what I wanted, that my steps were leading me toward freedom, but now freedom felt like emptiness. A few minutes later, I finally wrote to him, Alfredo left. The message was sent, and almost immediately came the reply, I can come over. I stared at the screen, but something inside me resisted. Yes, I could call him, try to fill this gaping hole with his presence, his words. But everything felt wrong. Instead of responding, I went outside. The evening was cool, a light breeze ruffled my hair. I walked, not knowing where I was headed, just following my steps. The streets of the city were familiar, but that evening they seemed different, as if I was looking at them through the lens of new emotions. I felt like a stranger in this familiar place, as though I no longer belonged to the city or to my own home. My legs led me to the bridge where Nestor and I used to meet. It was quiet there, the faint sound of the river breaking the oppressive silence. I stood by the railing, looking at the water. The reflections of the light seemed as wavering as my own thoughts. I closed my eyes, feeling the wind caress my face. In my mind, Alfredo's words kept spinning, you chose another path. But was it really my choice? Or had I just let myself be swept away by the current? I opened my eyes and looked down at the water. It flowed slowly but surely, with no intention of stopping. Maybe I could do the same. Just keep moving forward, without looking back. Footsteps behind me made me turn. Nestor stood in the shadows, his face illuminated only by the faint light of a nearby street lamp. He looked concerned, yet uncertain. It was strange to see him like this. He had always seemed like someone who knew exactly what he wanted. Why are you here? I asked, not hiding my surprise. You didn't answer. I thought something had happened, he said, taking a step closer. His voice was soft, but there was tension in it. Something has happened, I admitted. But it's not something you can fix. He frowned, stopping a few steps away from me. I can try. If you give me a chance. I looked at him, and at that moment, It felt like a chasm opened up between us. He was part of the world I had chosen, but now I couldn't tell if I was ready to fully enter it. You always seemed like the answer, I began, trying to find the right words. But now I'm not sure if the question ever made sense. Nestor was silent. His gaze was attentive, but he didn't interrupt. I felt my words, sharp as stones, falling into the water between us. I need time, I finally said. I don't know what to do. I don't know what I feel. His face remained calm, but a shadow of disappointment flickered in his eyes. Okay, he said. I'll give you time. But I won't wait forever, Lucia. He turned and left, leaving me alone on the bridge. I watched him go, but didn't take a step to stop him. I was alone. Nestor had offered for me to move in with him, but I had refused. Sylvia came to see me one evening. You need to find yourself, Lucia, she said, hugging me. I took up the brushes and began painting a new picture. It was of a bridge, where I stood alone, watching the sunset. My past was left behind me, but ahead was a horizon full of hope. The painting slowly came to life under my hands. Each brushstroke felt like a step deeper into myself, as if I were pulling from within a truth long forgotten. The bridge on the canvas emerged from the twilight, its stone arches reaching up to the sky, vanishing into the bright, almost unnatural hues of the sunset. I stood on it alone, my figure just an indistinct silhouette, gazing into the distance. The paint didn't go on smoothly, as if reluctantly yielding to my vision. I knew I wasn't just creating an image. This was a confession, an attempt to capture on canvas that delicate boundary I was now standing on. The past and the future collided, leaving me suspended in a place where decisions felt impossible, and hopes were fragile, like a thin ray of light on water. Sylvia sat behind me, silent, but her presence was palpable. She didn't ask questions, didn't offer advice. She simply watched as I tried to express what couldn't be put into words. I wonder where you're going, she finally said, breaking the silence. I stopped, the brush hovering over the palette. I don't know, I answered honestly. Maybe I'm just trying to find a place where it won't hurt so much. When the painting was finished, I stepped back to assess it. The picture was no longer just a bridge. It had become my step forward, even if uncertain. On the canvas, I was already moving toward the horizon, and that was the beginning of something new.